Hello, welcome to a video about the p5 oscillator class that is part of the p5 sound library. So what is the p5 oscillator class for? It is for, well, it's for creating oscillators. And it's for creating oscillators specifically in the context of sound. That's why it's in the sound library. What is meant by an oscillator is anything that kind of varies in a repetitive way over time. So examples of that, maybe the most obvious example that's connected to sound is something like a guitar string, right? When we pluck a guitar string, it vibrates at a particular rate over time, and it's that vibration of the string that creates the sound that that string makes. Faster it vibrates, the higher the pitch that we hear coming out of it is. And on a guitar, that's affected by things like the size of the string and how hard we pluck it and the resonance of the guitar and so on. But the principle is that the string oscillates. It moves backwards and forwards at a particular frequency, and that generates sound. And that's the same principle of this idea of oscillators in P5. It's just that in P5, what we're going to be doing is making oscillators with the computer instead of with a guitar string. You know, the computer is my guitar string in this case. So that's what it is, and that's what the basic idea of an oscillator is. We're super interested in this in particular because it relates to creating music with our computers, right? Which is a cool thing. So let's hop over to the reference for the P5 sound library, which is where this lives, right? And how would we find the oscillator? Well, we could either know that it's there, which we do. I have literally just been talking about it, and here it is here. Or we could just be kind of reading through the documentation of P5 sound and find that oscillators is a thing that the library can do. It's a very common thing that you'll find in various different kinds of sound libraries. And that's because oscillators are really kind of the basis of computer music. It's the fundamental way that we can generate sounds. Instead of using sound files, we can generate sounds with oscillators. And we can see from the description here that what a P5 oscillator does, if we just read the basics, it generates sine, triangle, square, and sawtooth waveforms. So that's the base premise of oscillators, is that they are waveforms. And you're probably familiar, maybe you shudder with horror to remember your old days of doing maths of some kind, but you may remember the sine wave, right? So here's a sine wave on Wikipedia, where you can see that it's a waveform that oscillates between the values 1, which is at the top here, and -1, which is at the bottom. So it goes up and down from -1 up to 1 and back down again in this wave pattern that repeats itself over time. So that's what we're talking about, for example, when we talk about a sine wave. This also mentions triangle, square, and sawtooth waveforms. They are all the same basic idea. They're waveforms that oscillate between different values. However, they're just different shapes, right? The triangle is pointy, the square is squared off, the sawtooth is sawtoothy. you kind of get the picture, right? So that's what an oscillator is for in the context of P5 sound, generating sound. So the best way to understand basically everything in programming is to try it out. So let's click through to the oscillator documentation and take a look, because that's gonna help us. So here's the example. It's kind of long, but let's just trigger it and see what happens first. So let's click here. Ooh. Ooh. Oh, very nice. Ooh, yeah. So you can see that the pitch of the sound is based on where I am on the X. And you can see this is written here below with these numbers. The more to the right on the X I am, the higher the pitch. That's low, that's high. Pitch is referred to as frequency in this context. That's how often the waveform oscillates. It goes from low to high and back again. And then you can see the amplitude is being tied to the y-axis here. As I move up and down, it's louder at the top and quieter at the bottom. And it's got that cool little woo sound to it, which is neat as well. So immediately we can kind of feel like vaguely excited about oscillators. Like we're causing sound to be made by our computer purely from computation, not from any kind of pre-created file. And by not kind of pre-baking these things into files, it gives us the potential to play dynamically with sound, which is exciting. So let's kind of go through this. So we've got this example. The code itself is kind of complicated, but we can probably at the very least dip into it to see certain possibilities. In particular, for example, we can see this is where they create one of these oscillators, because we can see this new p5.Oscillator thing. Here we can see the type of waveform that it's creating, a sine wave in this instance. We also heard mention of triangle and sawtooth waves and square waves, so that's good to know. And then kind of poking around in here a bit more, we can see where that mapping stuff was happening. This is how we're working out what the frequency and amplitude of our waveform should be. And then down here we can kind of see, okay, so this is where we're actually setting the frequency and the amplitude. So OSC, which I think is an unfortunate abbreviation, OSC stands for oscillator, right? We set the frequency with something called FREQ, F-R-E-Q, and you can see that we're setting the frequency, but we can also see there's this extra number, which we can understand, thankfully, because they've put a comment here that says smooth the transition by 0.1 second. So it's blending up to that frequency or to that frequency from whatever frequency it was already playing, which is kind of cute. And then we can see it's doing the same thing to set the amplitude, amp. What else can we tell from here? Oh, and I guess we can tell from here in play oscillator, if we want the oscillator to make a sound, we use this start method. So we can actually learn quite a lot from the example, even if we don't feel like 100% comfortable with the way it's written. For instance, with this weird canvas stuff for mouse pressed, etc. We can kind of pull out some of the details that we understand as programmers must be how it's controlling, in this instance, the sound. Woo. Okay. So that's the example. So it's good to always look at these things. You can also cut and paste it into a program and check it out yourself. That's a reasonable thing to do. In this instance, I'm just going to kind of take note of that and then carry on. So the description creates a signal that oscillates between -1 and 1. We know that that's how these waveforms work, like sine works and cosine works as well. By default, the oscillation takes the form of a sinusoidal shape. That just means a sine wave. Fancy word though, sinusoidal. Additional includes triangle, sawtooth, and square. So these are waveforms that just sound a bit different because of the shape of their waveform. The frequency defaults to 440 oscillations per second. That's 440 hertz. Frequencies get talked about in this measurement form called hertz, which is oscillations per second. So 440 hertz, as they point out, is the pitch of a standard A note, if we're talking about this musically. So that's nice to know as well. And indeed, if you halve that to 220 hertz, that will be A, again, an octave lower, and if you double it to 880 hertz, I think I'm not talking nonsense right now, if you double it to 880 hertz, then that would be an A note 1 octave higher. I think that's how that works. Please forgive me if you're a musician and I just butchered that explanation. We can set the type of oscillation with set type, it's saying, or by creating a specific kind of oscillator. This is getting pretty inside baseball, but you can see there's also a synosc, a triosc, a squirosc, and a sawosc. So I guess if we really want to create a specific kind of oscillator, we can do that in this way, but we can also just tell it what type, or we can just use the default type, which is sine. So quite a lot of stuff going on in there, but it's worth reading just to kind of get some picture about what's going on. And in the syntax section, which tells us how to create one of these things, we can see we say new p5 oscillator, and then we don't have to, but we can. The square brackets mean that this is optional. We can specify the frequency that it should play at by default, and we can specify the type of waveform, sine, triangle, sawtooth, or square, if we want to. Otherwise, it will default to 440 hertz and sine by standard. So that's useful. That's all very useful indeed. And then, as with any API, remember this is API documentation, application programming interface, documentation for the p5.Oscillator class. We want to read the methods to see what kinds of possibilities there are. It's mercifully simple, actually, in the case of oscillators, at least in terms of the basics. The most basic thing is you make one so that it has a frequency and a waveform associated with it. You use start to start an oscillator, so it starts emitting sound, audio. Again, like always, we need to care about autoplay policy in browsers. It's exactly the same issue as with playing any kind of sound in a browser. We have to have a user interaction to be allowed to do so. So we have to care. We might use user start audio as a way to smooth that out. There is a corollary stop to stop an oscillator. So we start it with start, stop it with stop. That seems fairly straightforward. Amp is used to set the amplitude. Amplitude is the word for volume, basically, when we're talking about audio signals. So how loud is it? 0 is completely silent. 1 is as loud as it can reasonably be, I take it. Just guessing. We saw that used in the example. And frec is to set the frequency. That's this number in hertz, which corresponds to the pitch, effectively, of the sound. So 220 is an A sort of a lower A. 440 is an A, an octave higher, I think. 880 is an A, an octave higher than that, I think. And then there's other stuff too. I'm not going to worry too much about this other stuff. I think the thing that I'm going to be interested in right now is I'm going to be interested in the frequency, because that's really the key quality of a waveform that really changes what it sounds like radically. So that's kind of where I think I want to play. But now I think the key thing that we probably want to do is we probably want to write some code. So let me just delete some stuff that I already had here. I guess I'll leave that there. And I'll delete this preload. So one of the beauties here is that I don't need a preload. I don't need to load a sound file. I'm going to generate sound from within my program. That's an exciting kind of idea. I'm leaving user start audio in here just out of politeness, just in case it helps. But again, I'm going to do any actual starting or stopping of my oscillator when I create one using mouse pressed. So how do I go about writing an example? I want to do that same kind of idea where I'm going to just create an oscillator and have it make sound. That would be my first victory, right? So I know from the syntax description that I have to create a new oscillator object. I could try and create it up here. I'm going to call it oscillator. I kind of prefer that to calling it OSC. I just find those abbreviations kind of offensive. I could try creating one here. p5.Oscillator, I know, was the syntax, right, that we saw. However, generally speaking, I think when we're working with these P5 libraries, it's a bit of a risk to try and create them outside in the sort of main variable declarations. It would be better to declare the variable here, but to actually create it inside setup so that we know that P5 is kind of ready. So let's say oscillator is assigned new p5.Oscillator. That was the syntax that we saw, at the top here. Where is it? Here, right? We say new p5 oscillator. We can specify the frequency and the type, so let's do so. Let's give it a really boring standard frequency. This is indeed the default 440 hertz. And we're going to specify that we want the sine wave. That's also the default. So again, I didn't have to write these. These are the defaults. But it's nice generally, I think, when you're experimenting to make explicit the things that you can make explicit, because I might want to play with those, right? And indeed, I will want to play with those to kind of see what is possible. So that creates the oscillator. But just creating an oscillator doesn't make it make a sound. It just has the potential to make a sound now, right? So if I want to hear the oscillator, I needed to do something else. So let me refer back to the documentation. And it's the first one listed, which is helpful. Start an oscillator. So starting the oscillator will actually begin, it tells it to start making sound. Now, it's kind of funny that there's that two-step, right? Like you create it with new oscillator, but that doesn't make a sound. It's only when you start it that it actually starts emitting its sound. So we use start to start it, and we use stop to stop it. So let's embed that into some interactions. So let's just say, I don't really need anything in draw. When I press down on the mouse, let's start the oscillator. So I say oscillator, which is my variable with the new oscillator in it. And I say start, not play, start. It's start because now we're cool kind of signal processing people, not just playing sound files. We're generating sound, like edgy, futuristic cyberpunk DJs. I kind of wish I hadn't said that. It's too late now. I'm going to stop the sound on a mouse released. So when I let go of the mouse button, I'm going to tell the oscillator to stop. That was correct, right? That was stop, right? I'm just going to look in the documentation. Yes, stop. So that's what I say when I want it to stop making its noise. And that's it. Start and stop. That's it. Let's go look at our exciting program now. We've done the basic steps. So there's my program. I click down, and I let go, and that's it. So I can click, and for as long as I hold the mouse down, the oscillator starts and plays its tone. I can do Morse code. Please help me. Please help me. You can already do interesting things literally just by being able to control the tone. It means stuff, right? That could be like I don't know, a bomb that's about to explode. I don't know why I'm being so negative. Oh, could be a heart rate monitor. Good grief, there's a lot of apparently depressing things that you can do with an oscillator already. However, that's kind of the basic principle. So we've got a thing that can emit a tone when I press down the mouse button. Perfect. There's already stuff I can play with, right? Like you might be curious, like what does a triangle wave sound like? And they said we could just write triangle to specify a triangle wave. So we can put it in there and we can see how it sounds. Different, very different, right? This is just a quality of kind of the shape of the wave. This is a pointy wave. It even sounds pointier. So that's what a triangle wave sounds like. There was also sawtooth, I believe. Woo! Jeepers creepers, that was a bit painful. You need to be a bit careful about the volume going into your headphones because it might injure you. Oh, that sounds very exciting. What was the other one? Oh, square wave, right? Square. That's sort of very loud. So they have different qualities. They kind of feel different from one another. I'll go back to sine just because it's the smooth jazz of of waveforms. And the other thing, obviously, that we can change is this number. So I can make it smaller. You can hear how that's an octave down, right? I think I was right about that. If I halve it again, we go another octave down. Oh, it's like the Barry White of sine waves there. Half of that would be what, 55? Oh yeah. So it can go arbitrarily low. Like what does a 1 hertz waveform sound like? Nothing. Some things are just too bassy to even be heard. I don't know what the lowest audible thing is. Can't hear that either. Maybe you can hear that. I can hear a little something actually there at 10 hertz. And you can go up as well, like 880 or something, right? That's high pitched. So there's a lot to play with. And the fact that there's a lot to play with suggests that we should play with it by kind of programming the play rather than just kind of typing stuff in here. Like typing stuff in here is a good first approximation to explore ideas, but you can often explore a lot more if you make something interactive. So how would we go about doing that? Let's say we want to play around with this frequency, right? It can start at 440, but as in the example, I want to play around with what the frequency is kind of live. If we think back to the documentation, we were reading, we ran into this, right? The frequency method. Set the frequency of an oscillator. Importantly, we can set the frequency while a program is running. That's what the example above did. So let's replicate that idea in our own words. So let's go look at the frequency documentation. I've clicked through now to the frec method. It's got exactly the same sort of way of writing things up here. The thing we really care about is noticing that we can say oscillator.frec and set it to a specific hertz. And that's how we change it. You can do other stuff you can see here. Ooh, boo, indeed. So what it's doing there is setting the frequency to 600 and then taking it down to 60 over 0.7 seconds. So you can see a cool thing you can do that I'm not going to explore here is set the frequency so that it shifts in frequency over time to create cool laser sound effects. Very satisfying. However, I'm just interested in changing the frequency at all because I want to map the mouse to the frequency. So that's how I'm going to do it, right? So how are we going to do that? We'll leave this stuff here. That seems fine. But what I want to do in draw is every frame, let's check where the mouse Y is. And the closer it is to the top of the screen, let's set the frequency higher. Closer it is to the bottom of the canvas, let's set the frequency lower. So we'll create a variable to store that in, the frequency that we want to set our oscillator to. And because we want to do it based on the mouse, as always, our good friend map comes in handy. And I want to map the Y position of the mouse, its vertical position. I know that that's a number between 0 and the height. However, I'm going to do it between height and 0, because height is going to be the lowest position that I want it to be, right? It's at the bottom of the canvas. 0 is the highest position. So I'm going to reverse those two. And then it's just the range that I would like to map between. So what do I want to map between? Let's take it like 0 hertz. Clearly doesn't sound like anything, because if you have 0 hertz, then you're not oscillating. all the way up to, what, 880 hertz. Let's do that and see how that goes. So from 0 to 880, so when my mouse is at the bottom of the canvas, 0 hertz. When my mouse is at the top of the canvas, 880 hertz. So let's see. I hold down the mouse. Oh, I didn't do anything. I got overexcited. Everybody among you may have noticed I didn't actually set the frequency of the oscillator. I just calculated it. So I have my exciting number here in new frec, but for it to work, I have to say oscillator, oscillator. That's a different thing. Got to be careful of those. Set the frequency to new frec, whatever is in there. Ferrec. That's kind of like Maltese. Anyway, oscillator.frec to new frec. So whatever we calculated based on the mouse position, set the oscillator to that frequency. So if I start down low, it's that, but now you can hear. Oh my. Ay. So by waving my mouse around in the vertical, I'm kind of creating transitions between different frequencies, right? And it's pretty expressive. It's kind of lascivious almost. I can even oscillate it myself, right? Regular, repetitive variation. So that way we can kind of explore like how the oscillator works a little bit better. We can see what the influence on changing frequency is, what the different frequencies sound like, but also what it sounds like to move between frequencies. And really it starts to sound a bit like an instrument. Bit of an instrument, right? Like we can kind of play things almost on purpose, depending on where I click as well. We can kind of do that. It's already too satisfying. I can't stop doing it. And one of the things that this sounds like is a bit like a theremin, which is an instrument that you play with your hands, kind of the proximity of your hands. You can kind of glide between different frequencies and amplitudes, volume. And it's a cool instrument, but it's the kind of the spooky instrument that comes, you hear it in kind of cheesy science fiction movies from the 50s or something like that to signify creepy, ghosty, alien stuff is going on. So we have most of a theremin, to be quite honest, right now by modulating the frequency based on our Y position. We could also modulate the amplitude based on our X position to kind of complete the theremin inputs. And this is like not a perfectly accurate theremin, but nonetheless it's not terrible. So if we recall in the documentation for oscillator, just before the frequency thing for setting frequencies, we can see there's one called amp. That's for setting the amplitude or volume of the oscillator. And if I click through to that, there's not a hell of a lot to it. Amp, and then what do you want the volume to be? The volume needs to be between 0 and 1. So 1, very loud, 0, completely silent. So I could map the X position to the volume, which I know is between 0 and 1. So we can do exactly the same thing that we just did with the frequency, right? My new amplitude is going to be a map, because I'm converting from the mouse's X position. We know the mouse's X position is between 0 and the width of the canvas. And I'll just map that straightforwardly to volume. So the closer it is to the left, to 0, we'll modulate to 0 amplitude. And the closer it is to the right, the width of the canvas, we'll map that to a full amplitude of 1. And then it remains to remember to set the amplitude by saying oscillator.amp. Amp is the method to the new amplitude, just like that. And then we head back. And then if I'm down here, you can hear as I go to the left, it gets very quiet. And I kind of fade it in. It's obnoxiously loud in my headphones, at least. And as I wave my mouse around, we get kind of cool sound stuff. And you could imagine if you spent a bit of time playing around with it, you could start to play kind of tunes, and you could get quite expressive with it, because you're enabling expressive interaction for the user, because you're providing this kind of way of controlling an oscillator, and that's exciting. That's a thing that is super fun for a user. It's fun for you to discover different possible combinations of sound. So again, programming wins. Programming saves the universe, sort of. One thing that this kind of experiment makes me think as I make the sound sort of obnoxiously loud. That's 880 hertz, right? Actually, it's getting a bit higher. Is like how high can I hear? And we can very, very easily turn this thing into a hearing test. So let's make a hearing test. So the standard human hearing range is something between about 20 hertz, very low, and about 20,000 hertz, 20 kilohertz, which is very extremely high pitched. That's in theory the range that people can hear in between. So if I wanted to test that, the first thing that I could do is when I'm checking my new frequency, instead of being between 0 and 880, I could make it between 20 and 20,000. That's the human hearing range, right? So that's the range that I want to check. Just because you may have heard just how obnoxious the oscillator can sound at extremely high volumes, I'm also just going to set the amplitude in the setup because I just wanted to apply all the time. So I'm just going to set it once at the beginning. I'm going to set the oscillator's amplitude to like 0.1 just so it doesn't kill me. I can always set it higher if I want to, but that way I'm not going to accidentally blow out my ear. So if I do this and I go back over and play around with it, now it's going to be setting the frequency between 20 and 20,000. So I could hold down here. It's quite high pitched. And as it goes up, you can hear it's getting higher and higher pitched. It was already semi-painful to listen to, even at that low amplitude. But if I do this, it's not much of a hearing test because I can't tell what frequency it is. So the other thing that I should really do in Draw is display the current frequency. And we can just do that with text. That's probably the easiest way. So let's do that by setting a text size and text align. I'll align it to the left just because it's going to be a number and it's probably better if it aligns left. And do I need to do anything else? I'll set the fill to white so I definitely can see it. And then what do I want to put out onto the screen? I want to put out whatever value is inside the new frec variable, which is the current frequency. And I'll display it sort of with an indent of 100 on X and in the center on Y. Okay, so I just want to display whatever the current frequency is. So if I go back and look at it now, you can see as I move my mouse up, that frequency is going up all the way up to 20,000, right at the top there. And as I go down, it heads back down towards 0. And negative numbers, actually, as I go off the canvas. What does the negative frequency sound like? I almost don't want to know, but we can check. So now I can actually test my hearing, right? So that's 486, I can definitely hear that. 2,384 I can hear that. I'm still able to hear this, thank goodness. Ooh, that's uncomfortable, hope you're okay. Can still hear it, can still hear it. So my hearing, at least at this amplitude, is dying out around there. Maybe I can still hear it. Now I'm not so sure that I can hear it. So, you know, that's sad for me because apparently people can hear it all the way up here at 20,000, but I can't. I can hear it down here in the sort of 15.5, 16,000 range. What happens when it goes negative? It just goes up again. Oh, that's satisfying. That's a new discovery. Blee, blue, blee, blue, blee, blue, blee, blue. So that's also useful to know. So you can test your own hearing by using that program, see how high a frequency you can hear. The younger you are, the higher frequency you can hear. And as you get older, your frequency range diminishes, like all things, especially brain power. I feel that right now. Again, be kind to your ears. It is possible to generate tones and frequencies and really loud sounds in playing with these things that could blow out your headphones or blow out your ear. And I don't want that to happen to you. Let's continue experimenting. So that was a hearing test that was quite satisfying. This is just our little oscillator setup again. What if we didn't want the user to control the frequency by kind of waggling their mouse around, but we wanted to kind of shift frequencies in another way, kind of animate the frequency without the user. So let's chop this program down a little bit. So let's get rid of the user, which I can do. I can do. Do I want to? I'll get rid of the. Do I want to get rid of this? Yeah, no, we'll keep those. We'll keep these because we'll let the user activate the oscillator. They just won't be doing this mapping thing. So let's continue this idea that we're going to, I'll just make that a little louder just in case. We're going to we're going to generate a new frequency, but this time we're not going to base it on user input. what we're going to generate it on is another oscillator. So we know that the current wave that we're using as our waveform for the oscillator is a sine wave, and we know that a sine wave oscillates between -1 and +1 over and over again as you calculate the sine of a specific angle. We could actually use the sine function that does that to generate frequencies for our oscillator, our sine oscillator, to use. So what do I mean by that? Well, let us calculate the sine of an angle. So we're going to need an angle. So let's create an angle, and we'll start it at 0 up the top here. And let's generate our new frequency based on that angle. So let's calculate the sine of the angle. So we'll call that sine angle. And that's going to be sine. So P5 has a function called sine. Sin, it's always written. Always makes you feel a bit guilty. And we want the sin, or sine, of that angle. So this will calculate, based on an angle, what the sine of that angle is. And that is going to be a number between -1 and +1 that oscillates as the angle changes. So that's my sine of the angle. So how do I convert that to a frequency? So I know that sine angle is between -1 and +1. Again, it's going to make sense to map, right? So new frac, which is what I'm going to use for my oscillator. I'm going to map it. What am I going to map? I'm going to map the sine of my single angle. Single angles looking for other single angles. I'm going to map the sin angle, the sine of the angle, which is between -1 and 1. So that's the range that I'm coming from. And I'm going to map it to what? Well, some other frequency range that I want to oscillate between. So let's say 440 and 880. Classic. So it is within an octave of A to A, right? Do I need to do anything else, or is that it? I think it's as simple as that. How frightening. So what are we doing here? Oh, no, there's one more thing I need to do that I've conveniently forgotten. So we calculate the sine of the current angle. So at the beginning, that's 0. So it's going to be sine of 0. I think that's 0. So 0 is going to go in there into sine angle, and then I'm going to map whatever that was to a number between 440 and 880. So if sine angle is 0, that's halfway between -1 and +1, so we're going to get something that's halfway between 440 and 880, right? And we can test that out. Let's go look at that. So I hold down the mouse, I get that, whatever that is. It's like is it 660? Is it as simple as that? It's halfway between those two numbers. That's not very interesting, because the point of the sine function that we're using here is that as you increase the angle, it oscillates between -1 and +1. So the other thing that we should do is we should make the angle change. So let's add something to it. Let's add 0.1 and see what happens. So that's going to change the angle, that's going to change the output of the sine function, and that's going to change which frequency pops out of this map over time. So if I hold down my mouse now, that's beautiful. That's the sound of a sine function. Like, the sine function now is literally being used twice, right? It's being used to generate the oscillation that literally creates the tone that by oscillating the speaker. And it's also being used to control the frequency of that oscillation by varying it up and down according to how the sine wave moves. And clearly, that sounds like a siren, right? That sounds like a siren. How could we play around with this more? Well, if we change how quickly the angle changes by increasing it at a greater rate in draw, then we change how quickly our oscillator goes between those two frequencies. So we get twice as fast. Sounds more police car-like. If we do it even faster, 0.5. Very excitable now, that police car. It's getting really worked up about something. 1.5, I mean, I don't know where this is necessarily going. That's, well, it doesn't sound like a police car anymore. I don't know what that sounds like. Some kind of alien technology? Something. It's evocative. So that's an interesting thing to play around with. We can also, let's leave it on 1. We can change the range that we're oscillating in between. What if we went from 0 to 880 in our frequency range? That's pretty cool. Let's make it go a little less fast. It's a little alarming. Let's make it go at 0.1 again in terms of the rate of change. You can hear it really diving down there to the 0 hertz, right? And we could make 880 a much bigger number, 2000. It's already sounding like some pretty great electronica that I could release on Bandcamp or something like that. That might be a dated reference at some point. That's okay. We can make that go faster. You know, we can do all kinds of, we can make it go slower. We can make it go at a tenth the speed. Coming back up. It's super satisfying. I don't know what to tell you. That is fun. Is it embarrassing that I find this interesting? I don't know. But I mean, I think that this is pretty cool. So we've seen what happens if we play with the range of frequencies that we're oscillating in between with sine. Here with this number, we're seeing the rate of change of the angle, which changes the frequency of oscillation there. That's super fun. There are also other functions that oscillate, right? Like cosine also oscillates. What does that sound like? So it sounds exactly the same, really, and that's because cosine is really just sine that's slightly shifted on the x-axis. So it's not actually an interesting one. However, there is the other classic trigonometry function, tangent, tan, and this does sound significantly more interesting because it's got a really different waveform. That's pretty dancey beat coming from the tan function there. So what does it sound like that? The tan function, we can even go have a quick look at it. Tan function, we can find a picture. There you go. It does this weird thing, right? It's not the same kind of smooth oscillation up and down. It actually has these asymptotes, so it starts infinitely low and then goes infinitely high and then drops immediately back down to infinitely low, back up to infinitely high, drops. So you get that kind of really broken up sound where it jumps straight from high to low. And that's why it sounds like this. And it sounds cool. So these are the possibilities. There is a lot to play around with here. And like maybe this is another one of those moments where we think math is not so bad. Maybe math is actually kind of interesting. So we're playing around with oscillators. We're having fun. We're having a good time. What else can we do? Well, I always like to play around with the random function. So let's play around with the random function. We can just make it here again. So again, I'm always wanting to create a new frequency in some way. What if I create a random, I guess it's just a random number. I'll call it R. So let's create a random number between 0 and 1, the classic. And let's map that. So let's map R, which is my random number. It's between 0 and 1, right? And let's map whatever comes out of the random function to a number between 440 and 880. So what are we going to get? We're going to get frequencies that jump around in that range unpredictably. And what does that sound like? Well, it's not easy necessarily to know what it sounds like, and that's part of the beauty of these kinds of sound experiments is you have to kind of try them out and you get to experience new sounds that you're generating with your program. So generate a random number between 0 and 1, pop it into this variable called R, map the resulting number, which we know is between 0 and 1, to something in a proper frequency range, 440 to 880, put that into our variable called new frec, and then set the new frec as the frequency of our oscillator. So what does it sound like? Pretty cool. Pretty cool. Sounds like a cool sci-fi computer. We can change that range again. I mean, this is, again, you can play around in the same kinds of ways, right? Pretty satisfying. What if we also had a 0? So it's a really big range. Deeply satisfying. I don't know what to tell you. That is super satisfying, worth playing around with. So that's giving you some kind of evocation of, yeah, like busy and industrial, something that's working hard on a really complicated problem that you couldn't possibly understand, sort of thing. At least that's what it sounds like to me. And you know, no experiment in this vein would be complete without playing around briefly, at least, with. I should delete this angle. Really, it's no longer relevant. Playing around with Perlin noise, which I think is the kind of the most fun thing. So what do we need if we want to play around with Perlin noise? The thing that you need is this thing called the time step. I'm going to call it a variable called t for time. It's going to start at 0, and it's kind of a bit like the sine function, right? You give an angle to sine and you increase it to sort of cause it to oscillate. The noise function kind of works the same way. So let's use it quickly. So let's call this noise value. And we use the noise function, and what we do is we give it this time step. that we've got. So it starts out at 0, and like sine, as we increase the time step, the t, it will cause the result from noise to bring out this kind of oscillating-ish result, except that it oscillates in a kind of an organic way. So not oscillating really in the sense of regular movement between values, but instead it kind of plays between the values 0 and 1 in this instance. So rather than r here, we want to map the noise value. Again, it's between 0 and 1, so this makes sense, and we'll map it again to sort of safe values to begin with, 440 and 880. And as with sine, we need t to change over time. So let's increase it by what? 0. Whatever, 0.1. Let's see what that does. So t starts at 0. We calculate the noise value at 0, the time 0 if you like, and then we map that number, which is between 0 and 1, to a frequency between 440 and 880. We set our oscillator to that frequency, and then every frame we're going to increase t by something so that it moves around, so that it moves around as t changes. The result that we get from noise changes. So again, what does that sound like? Sounds kind of like a trapped insect. So this is potentially quite a high number, so let's change it down a bit to 0.05 and see if that sounds a bit different to us. You can kind of hear that unlike a standard oscillator, it's not regular in its pattern, right? But it's also not like random in that it's not just jumping between frequencies, it's smoothly transitioning between frequencies, but it's doing so in an unpredictable way. That's the beauty of noise, that's what it does. And if it's suitable for your purposes, then it's perfect for that. Let's do the same thing. Let's change between some really different. Maybe let's not use the full human hearing range, but let's give it a sort of a bigger range to play with, 20 to 2000. Let's listen to it now. So you can hear it sort of sitting at particular sorts of levels and staying there, but then also transitioning. Sounds a little bit like Flight of the Bumblebees or something. It's quite expressive. It sounds alive. Like this is kind of the quality that this noise function has. It has this kind of simulation of life somehow. So, I mean, God, come on, that's fun. Who is that? You need to figure out who that is. So we're basically using maths now. We're playing with maths. Maybe you didn't like maths before, maybe you did, but now you love it. You're like, bring on more maths because it's super fun. So we've got these oscillators. They're represented by this p5.Oscillator object. They represent a kind of a tone that we can play, such as at 440 hertz. That's the number of oscillations in a second. And there's different waveforms that we can use. The sine wave is the smooth jazz one, and then there's also sawtooth and square and triangle. And we can play around with the frequency. We can either let the user play with the frequency, or we can play with the frequency via programmatic means like the noise function or the random function or trigonometry functions like sine. And we can just get all of these interesting musical or just sonic results. And there's a lot that we can do with these ideas moving forward. You can imagine that an object maybe that moves around on the screen emits a tone based on the way that it's moving. And that would be an expressive and kind of procedural way of generating the sound that object makes, for example. So there's a lot to take in there. I hope that I have made the case for mathematics and also for just p5 oscillators and the fun things that we can do with generative music. Thanks for coming on that journey with me, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.